The scream that finally broke 3 years of silence in the Hale house didn't come from either of the twins. It came from Richard Hale, standing between the vineyard rows at golden hour, watching his daughters run with their arms thrown wide, laughing so hard they could barely stay upright. He hadn't heard that sound since the funeral. He didn't move. He didn't call out. He stood the way a man stands when he's afraid that breathing wrong might shatter the moment like glass. Then he saw who was running with them barefoot in the dirt, laughing just as hard. The new housekeeper. 4 days. She had been in his house 4 days. Before that afternoon in the vines, before the sound of 2 6-year-old girls laughing loud enough to carry across 100 acres of Cabernet, Hale Vineyards ran with the precision of a machine that had forgotten what it was built for. The main house, a long, low structure of pale stone and glass sitting above the valley like a held breath, kept its curtains drawn even at noon. Sunlight came through in thin, apologetic strips, landing on dust that never seemed to settle because no one moved fast enough to stir it. The staff wore soft-soled shoes, doors closed with a care that bordered on reverence. Nobody raised their voice in that house, not because anyone had asked them not to, but because 3 years earlier grief had walked in through the front door and simply never left, and everyone had learned to step around it the way you step around a sleeping animal that might still bite. The household ran on an unspoken schedule that every employee had memorized without ever being told. The cook, a broad-shouldered woman named Dolores who had worked for the family since before the twins were born, prepared 3 meals a day with the same careful attention she'd always given them, though she'd stopped expecting the plates to come back anything but full. The tutor arrived at 8 sharp and left at 4, teaching 2 girls who answered every question with a nod or a shake of the head, never a sentence. The gardener kept the hedges trimmed into rigid geometric shapes, but had long ago stopped touching the wild tangle of climbing roses along the east fence, because the one time he'd tried, years back, Richard had come out onto the porch and told him, in a voice gone suddenly hoarse, to leave that part alone. Richard kept his office in the old barrel room, converted now into a place of spreadsheets and yield projections, the smell of oak, and must replaced by the cold hum of a wine cooler stocked with bottles he never opened. He told himself the numbers were for his daughter's future. He told himself that keeping the winery profitable, keeping the Hale name solvent, was itself a form of love, and maybe once it had been, but lately the truth sat closer to the surface than he liked. The ledgers were easier to look at than his own children's faces. Numbers didn't flinch. Numbers didn't go quiet the second he walked into a room. Every evening before dinner he made his ritual visit to the playroom, a bright space that looked more like a boutique than a place where children actually lived. Emma and Ava sat on the floor in matching cardigans, surrounded by dolls that never got rearranged into anything resembling a game. He'd stand in the doorway and ask the same question in the same flat voice. "Everything all right, girls?" And they would nod, without lifting their eyes, and he would take that nod as proof his system was working. He did not see the silence. He saw obedience, and to him, obedience looked like safety. It never occurred to him to wonder why 2 children with a room full of toys never actually played. The girls hadn't spoken not one full sentence, not to him, not to their tutor, not to the housekeeping staff since the morning 3 years ago when their mother, Sarah, had been found in the rose garden she loved, gone before the ambulance arrived. Richard had responded to that morning the way he responded to every crisis in his life. He had taken control. He hired the best grief counselor money could find, sat through exactly 4 sessions before deciding the girls seemed stable enough, and quietly let the arrangement lapse. He banned Sarah's name from casual conversation, believing that hearing it would only reopen the wound. When a new gardener once mentioned how much the lady of the house had loved the climbing roses by the fence, Richard's expression turned to ice so fast the man apologized before he understood what he'd done wrong, and was let go within the month. Richard thought he was protecting his daughters. What he had actually done was turn their mother into a ghost they weren't allowed to speak of, a name that made the room go cold, a love that had somehow become a source of fear. At the dinner table each night, the girls pushed vegetables into small, careful piles and ate almost nothing. Dolores noticed and said nothing. because she'd learned that noticing things out loud in that house rarely went anywhere good. The head housekeeper, a precise woman named nothing to anyone but ma'am for 11 years, logged the girl's lack of appetite in her daily report and privately attributed it to childish moods. What worried her more, though she rarely admitted it even to herself, was how the twins' eyes slid away from their father's whenever he spoke to them, as though his presence were a light too bright to look at directly. She had built her entire professional identity around the appearance of a well-run household, and a well-run household, in her mind, did not include children who flinched from their own father, so she simply stopped writing that part down. Into this house walked Nora Bennett, hired through a staffing agency after the previous housekeeper's contract ended. She had taken the job for reasons she kept to herself: a modest apartment, 2 towns over, a need for steady hours, nothing dramatic. For her first several days, she was little more than a shadow in a gray uniform, indistinguishable from the rest of the quiet machinery of the estate. To Richard, she was a line item on payroll. To the household staff, she was simply the newest person who had yet to learn the invisible map of things that could not be said out loud. Nora, for her part, noticed everything the others had stopped noticing. She noticed the curtains that never opened past a hand's width. She noticed the untouched food scraped from plates twice a day. She noticed the tangle of roses along the east fence, clearly once tended with love and now left to grow wild and half-strangled by weeds. She felt, in every room she cleaned, an absence of air that no amount of polish could fix. She did not announce herself. She simply began, in small ways, to let a little more light in. While dusting the front room, she'd pull the drapes an inch farther than strictly necessary, just enough for a stripe of afternoon sun to fall across the floor. She rearranged a vase of lilies so they leaned toward the window instead of away from it. On her third afternoon, drawn by nothing more than instinct, she knelt by the wild rose bushes on her lunch break and began clearing the weeds, choking their roots, careful not to damage the canes themselves. She told no one. It became a quiet, unofficial habit, 15 minutes most days, dirt under her nails, before she went back inside to finish her shift. One afternoon, cleaning the playroom, she paused in front of a framed photograph, Sarah laughing on a beach, one twin on each hip, and instead of looking away, the way everyone else in that house had trained themselves to do, she smiled at it. Small, private, unremarkable to anyone watching. Dolores happened to pass the doorway at that exact moment, saw the smile, and felt something she couldn't name catch in her throat. She didn't say anything either. But that night, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she made an extra portion of the girl's favorite dessert, just in case. Nothing in that house was truly unremarkable anymore. Every gesture of warmth was a seed dropped into dry ground, and dry ground, given enough time, remembers how to grow. Nora's bond with the twins did not arrive with any grand gesture. It grew the way real trust grows, in the unglamorous minutes nobody else thought were worth their attention. While folding laundry in the small room off the kitchen, she told the girls stories about the stars, how some people believed they were the eyes of people who loved you, still watching from somewhere far away. When she brushed out their hair in the mornings, a chore the tutor usually handled with brisk efficiency, Nora turned it into something closer to a ritual, working through the knots with a patience that seemed to loosen something else at the same time. She never asked the girls directly about their mother. Instead, she talked about the garden, which flowers Sarah had loved best, according to what she'd learned from an old gardening log left in a drawer, and said it all so naturally that the subject stopped feeling like a landmine and started feeling like a story that belonged to them. The first crack in the silence came almost as a whisper. Nora was washing the tall windows in the front room when Ava crept up behind her and asked, in a voice so small it barely carried, "Do you think Mom would like this drawing?" She held out a piece of paper, a sun, 2 small stick figures holding hands. Nora knelt down to meet her at eye level and studied the drawing with real seriousness. "I think she'd love it," she said, "especially because you made it." Across the room, Dolores froze mid-step, a stack of clean napkins in her arms. staring at the child who had just spoken in a full sentence to someone who wasn't her father. She didn't say a word. She simply set the napkins down very carefully, as if any sudden movement might scare the moment away, and slipped out of the room to find the head housekeeper. The news moved through the staff quarters before dinner was even served. One of the girls had talked, and she hadn't said a word to her father or her tutor. She'd said it to the housekeeper. Emma, always the quieter of the two, showed her attachment differently. She began trailing Nora from room to room like a small shadow, sitting nearby with a book she never opened, simply watching. Before anyone else in the house woke, she started leaving a single wildflower from the garden outside the door of Nora's small room in the staff wing, a silent offering that only the two of them understood. Nora never mentioned it to anyone, but she kept every one of them pressed flat between the pages of an old paperback, a small private collection that meant more to her than she let herself admit. The head housekeeper watched all of this unfold with a hostility she barely bothered to hide, and if anyone had asked her to explain it, she might have struggled to find words that didn't sound petty even to herself. It wasn't only about order. 11 years she had run this house through its worst days, had absorbed the grief of it into her own bones, had told herself that keeping everything precisely in its place was its own form of care for two children who had lost their mother. Watching a woman 4 days into the job undo in an afternoon what she hadn't managed in 3 years felt less like insubordination and more like an accusation she wasn't ready to hear. So she called it insubordination instead, because that was easier. She began documenting every interaction, waiting for the moment she could bring it to Richard as evidence. That moment came sooner than she expected. A written report landed on Richard's desk one evening, detailing with clinical precision how Nora was distracting the children from their routines and fostering inappropriate closeness that could be harmful to their development. The Richard of a month earlier would have summoned Nora immediately and reminded her, coldly, of her place. But something in him had already begun to shift, though he couldn't have named what. He folded the report, put it in a drawer, and said only, "I'll take it under consideration." His inaction was itself a decision, a small crack in the armor he'd worn since the funeral. Not long after, a muffled cry pulled Nora from sleep in the middle of the night. It came from the girls' room. She found Ava sitting bolt upright, shaking from a nightmare, while Emma cried silently beside her. The tutor didn't live on the property and wouldn't have heard anyway. The head housekeeper's room was closer, but she hadn't stirred, or had stirred and chosen not to come. Nora didn't turn on the overhead light. She sat on the edge of the bed and told them a story in a low voice about a forest where the trees kept lost children safe until morning. She stroked Ava's hair until the shaking stopped, and held Emma's hand until her tears dried, staying in the dark until both girls slept again, feeling, for the first time in a long while, the warmth of someone steady in the darkness. From the half-open door, Richard watched the whole scene, unable to make himself walk in, unable to make himself walk away. A mixture of gratitude and a deep, aching shame at not having been the one to do it settled into his chest and stayed there long after he'd gone back to bed. The head housekeeper, sensing her warning had gone unheeded, escalated. Using her authority over the household schedule, she quietly rearranged Nora's duties to keep her away from the girls. Cleaning shifts moved to hours when the twins were with their tutor. The kitchen and laundry room declared off-limits to the children under the excuse of safety. It was a campaign disguised as procedure, and it worked exactly as intended. Within days, the small light that had begun to flicker in the twins' eyes started to dim again. At lessons, they slipped back into monosyllables. Dinner plates came back untouched. Dolores watched it happen and said nothing, though she left the extra dessert in the fridge 2 more nights running, as if the sugar alone might hold the line. One afternoon, in open defiance, Ava refused to do her schoolwork and asked, with startling clarity, "Where's Nora?" The question hung in the air of the study, like something no one knew how to diffuse. The tutor, flustered, tried to redirect the lesson, and got only silence in return, the old silence, the one that had lived in that house for 3 years and had only just begun to loosen its grip. For Richard, Listening from the hallway on his way to the barrel room, the moment landed harder than any spreadsheet ever had. It wasn't Nora who had changed his daughters. It was her absence pulling them straight back into the dark, and he was the one who had allowed it to happen, quietly, from a distance, the same way he'd allowed almost everything in that house to happen for 3 years. The tension found its next level on a Thursday afternoon when the phone in Richard's office rang and his mother's voice came through, sharp, as always, without preamble. "Richard, I've been hearing some concerning things. Apparently one of the staff has been taking far too many liberties with my granddaughters. I trust you'll put things back in order. People need to be reminded of their place." The head housekeeper, loyal to the old order and perhaps relieved to have someone else carry the weight of the confrontation, had found herself a far more powerful ally. This threat was no longer internal. It came now from the matriarch of the family, a woman whose opinion Richard had never once, in his adult life, dared to challenge. His mother, Diane, arrived the following morning in a car so clean it seemed offended by the gravel drive. She stepped out in a cream linen suit, gave her son a brief, formal kiss on the cheek, and swept the property with a gaze that missed nothing. Diane had buried her own husband young, had raised Richard alone through a decade of lean years before the winery ever turned a profit, and had built her entire understanding of survival around control, around never, ever letting anyone see a family come apart at the seams. She did not see herself as cruel. She saw herself as the only person left who remembered how to hold a family together, and every ounce of her fear about what she was watching unfold in her son's house came from a place she would never once examine out loud. Within the hour, standing at the front window with an untouched cup of tea, she watched a scene in the garden that made her mouth tighten in quiet disapproval. Nora and the twins sitting in the grass, weaving a crown of daisies, Emma with a smudge of dirt on her cheek, laughing as she tried to fit it onto her sister's head. To Diane, it wasn't a picture of joy. It was a picture of collapse. "The discipline seems to have slipped quite a bit around here, son," she said, without turning from the window. Over dinner that night, she steered the conversation like a general commanding troops, asking pointed questions about the girls' routines, about staff management, each one a veiled accusation. "And this Nora," she said, cutting into her food with surgical precision, "what exactly are her qualifications to be shaping my granddaughter's upbringing?" She wasn't expecting an answer. She was planting doubt, reminding her son of his duty to appearances, to the family name, to the distance that kept respect intact. Richard found himself caught in a war he had no idea how to win. His mother's voice in his head arguing for the order and control he'd been raised to obey, and the plain evidence in front of his own eyes, his daughter's laughter, the light returning to their faces, the first full sentences in 3 years. He was torn between the man he'd been trained to be and the father he was desperate to become. The next incident happened in the library. Nora had found an old storybook that belonged to Sarah and was reading it softly to the girls in a corner when Diane walked in. She stopped cold at the sound of Nora's voice. "That book is inappropriate," she said, her tone freezing the air around her. "It belonged to their mother. You shouldn't be touching it." She crossed the room, took the book from Nora's hands, and returned it to the shelf with a gesture that left no room for argument. "The girls have their own books, the ones I bought them myself." The tutor, who happened to be gathering worksheets nearby, went very still, eyes fixed on the carpet, saying nothing. One more witness who understood exactly what was happening and chose the safety of silence over the risk of speaking up. The cruelty wasn't in the words. It was in the intention erasing any thread of connection to a past she wanted sealed away. Taking from 2 little girls a piece of their mother, they had only just gotten back. The twins didn't cry. They simply went still, a look of quiet devastation on their faces that Richard, watching from the doorway, felt in his own chest like a physical blow. That same night, his mother cornered him in his office, closes and has a door behind her, a signal that this conversation would allow no interruption. "This has gone too far, Richard," she said, her voice stripped of all warmth. "That woman is creating a dangerous fantasy in those girls' heads and undermining the order of this house. Either you let her go tomorrow morning, or I'll be forced to intervene in a way you won't like. This is about protecting my granddaughters from bad influence. The choice is yours, but don't pretend I didn't warn you." Overwhelmed, Richard did what he always did under pressure he didn't know how to face. He stalled. "I understand your concern, Mother. I'll think it over carefully." His mother studied him with a mixture of disappointment and quiet certainty, as though she already knew her will would win out, as it always had. She walked out and left him alone with the weight of a cowardice that burned in his stomach, because some part of him already understood that his inaction was its own kind of betrayal, a betrayal of the small spark of hope he'd watched come alive in his daughter's eyes. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dark of his office with the storybook incident replaying on a loop, and underneath it, older and heavier, the memory of the morning Sarah died, the ambulance lights against the vineyard rose, his own hands useless at his sides, the decision he'd made in the weeks after to simply stop saying her name, because it had seemed at the time like the only mercy he had left to give. The breaking point came the very next day, in a way no one saw coming. Richard was passing through the staff wing when he heard his mother's voice, cold and precise, coming from behind Nora's half-open door. He stopped, and through the gap he saw his mother standing over Nora, who sat very straight on the edge of her narrow bed, hands folded in her lap. "I trust you understand your presence here is no longer necessary or wanted," his mother was saying. "You'll be paid a generous severance for your discretion. Pack your things. A car will be waiting within the hour." In that instant, Richard saw Ava, who had secretly followed her grandmother down the hall, standing at the door, her face streaked with silent tears, one hand pressed flat against the doorframe, as if she might be able to hold the whole scene in place by will alone. The little girl looked up. Her eyes met her father's, and in them was not only sadness but an accusation, a silent question that tore straight through him. "Are you going to let them take her away?" That look was the final catalyst. Every argument about business, tradition, and the fear of confrontation that had governed Richard's life fell away, leaving behind one elemental truth: his duty as a father. He walked back into his own office, but not to hide. For the first time in 3 years, he stood in front of the framed photograph of Sarah on the wall, and instead of seeing a lost wife, he saw the mother of his children, and in her painted eyes he thought he saw the same question he'd just seen in Ava's. The pain in his chest shifted from something paralyzing into something clear and furious. There was no more doubt, no more fear, no more hesitation. On his way out, he passed the east fence and, without quite meaning to, stopped. The wild tangle of roses he'd told a gardener to leave alone 3 years ago was no longer wild. Someone had been clearing the weeds from around the roots, patiently, a little at a time, without ever once being asked. He hadn't noticed until that exact second. He stood there for one long breath, understanding all at once what it meant, and then he opened the door and walked down the hallway toward Nora's room, not as the head of an empire, but as a father ready to go to war for his daughters' hearts. Dinner that night wasn't a family meal. It was a silent courtroom. At one end of the long table, Diane sat with the rigid posture of a judge. At the other, Richard could barely lift his eyes from his plate. Between them, the vulnerable center of the whole dispute, Nora and the twins, eating with deliberate slowness, feeling every sideways glance pass over their heads. Diane set down her utensils with surgical precision, the sound landing like a gunshot in the tense quiet. "We've allowed this situation to go on too long," she said, gesturing vaguely toward Nora, without granting her the dignity of a direct look. "This woman is filling the girls' heads with fantasies, confusing their grief with an inappropriate familiarity. We know nothing about her, her intentions. She might be after something more than a paycheck." The accusation hung in the air, calculated to wound Nora and to awaken Richard's own deepest fears, the fear of losing control, of being deceived, of failing his family yet again. It was then that the small miracle happened. Ava, the quieter of the two, slid her chair back with a soft scrape. She stood and, with the solemnity of someone about to change the course of history, walked around the table, not toward Nora for shelter, not toward her grandmother to plead. She walked straight to her father. Her small hand landed on his arm. He felt the touch like an electric current, an anchor in the middle of his own internal storm. The girl looked up, her eyes meeting his. And then, in a clear, steady voice no one had heard from her in 3 years, she said, looking directly at her grandmother, "I'm not as scared at night when Nora's here." Then Emma, always the more observant one, added the second blow, her small voice carrying an ancient kind of wisdom. "And she tells us how Mom wanted us to learn about the grapes. She says Mom would be proud." Dolores, clearing a dish at the sideboard, stopped moving entirely, one hand pressed briefly to her mouth. In that instant, Richard understood that the memory he'd tried to seal away for 3 years hadn't been erased at all. It had been quietly kept alive, in the one part of the house he'd never thought to look, tended by a woman he'd hired 4 days ago, and had barely learned to see: the roses, the storybook, the gardening log she must have found in some forgotten drawer and read cover to cover before ever saying a word to his daughters about it. None of it had been an accident. All of it had been a slow, patient act of care that he, in 3 years of grieving loudly with his silence, had never once managed to offer. He stood. The movement was slow, carrying an authority that came not from his name or his bank account, but from the unshakable conviction of a father who finally understood his true duty. "It's over, Mother," he said. And though his voice was calm, it carried enough weight that everyone at the table held their breath. "For 3 years I've run this house, and my daughter's grief like one of my companies, with control, with distance, with a fear of disorder, and I have failed them completely." He turned to Nora. "You've been clearing the weeds from Sarah's roses since your 3rd day here. Nobody asked you to. Nobody even told you they mattered." His voice caught, just slightly. "Nora isn't going anywhere. She stays not as an employee to be reminded of her place. She stays as the person who accomplished what I couldn't. She gave my daughters their voices back. She stays as part of this family's recovery." He crossed the room and, for the first time without hesitation, wrapped his arms around both girls, feeling their small bodies finally relax against him, a surrender 3 long years in the making. Over their heads, his eyes met Nora's, and something unspoken passed between them, quiet and certain. Diane left the following morning without a scene, her suitcase already packed, her expression a mask that couldn't quite hide the rigidity of defeat. From the hallway window, she watched Richard on his knees in the wet grass, clumsily helping Emma tie her shoelaces while Ava crowned him with a ring of daisies, all 3 of them laughing. She understood, with a bitterness she'd never admit aloud, that her world of order and appearances no longer had a place in that house. She left the way she'd arrived, like a cold front pulling out, leaving the air behind it cleaner, warmer, full of things that hadn't existed there in years. The real change didn't show up in speeches. It showed up in a kitchen filled, for the first time in years, with the chaos of pancakes burning on the stove and flour dusted across the counters, Richard with a smear of batter on his nose trying to follow a recipe he'd found online, the twins on the counter laughing so hard they could barely hold the whisk. Dolores, who had spent 3 years cooking meals nobody finished, stood in the corner pretending to organize a spice rack so no one would notice her wiping her eyes. Nora watched from the doorway with a cup of coffee, a smile she couldn't have hidden if she'd tried. Sunlight poured through the open window, sweeping away the last traces of shadow. The house had stopped being a museum. For the first time in 3 long years, it was a home. The months that followed weren't an instant cure. They were a slow, deliberate relearning of how to breathe again. The heavy curtains came down, replaced by light drapes that let the morning sun dance across the floor. Nora, now officially promoted to house manager, no longer moved through the halls like a shadow, but with the quiet authority of someone whose place had been earned in a way no title could measure. She kept the east fence roses too, now with the gardener's full cooperation and, some mornings, the twins' muddy help. Richard, for his part, began the hardest work of his life, unlearning how to be an executive so he could learn how to be a father. His calendar, once packed with meetings, filled instead with notes like breakfast with my girls and walk the vineyard to look for ladybugs. He discovered, to his own surprise, that the winery didn't collapse without his constant supervision, and that the joy he'd been missing had been waiting the whole time, in small things. A burnt pancake devoured like a delicacy, a small hand reaching for his during a walk, a whispered "love you, Dad," before bed. There were harder days, too, ones he never mentioned to anyone but Nora. Evenings he sat with the girls and finally told them, in his own halting words, about the morning their mother died, about how sorry he was for the silence he'd built around her name instead of a bridge. Emma cried the first time he said it. So did he. Nobody in that house treated tears as something to hide from anymore. When the annual harvest celebration came around that autumn, it was nothing like the hollow social obligation it had been for the last 3 years. The estate didn't carry formality, it carried real, contagious joy. Emma and Ava, in simple white dresses, wove through the guests, handing out small glasses of the season's first pressed grape juice, which they themselves had helped harvest. Dolores had finally stopped making extra desserts just in case, because there was no more just in case the girls ate everything, every time, and asked for seconds. They weren't the ghost girls of the estate anymore. They were the confident young hosts of the party, cheeks pink with excitement, living proof that even after the harshest winter, life always finds its way back. At sunset, when the sky turned the same gold it had been the afternoon, everything changed. Richard climbed a small platform with his daughter's hands in his. The crowd went quiet. He looked out at his staff, his friends, and then his eyes found Nora, standing among the crowd near a table crowded with jars of roses, watching with a proud, quiet smile. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and clear, stripped of the businessman's formality. He didn't talk about yield or production numbers. He talked about his family, and at the end he said the words that would seal his transformation for good. This year I learned that the best harvest isn't the one you pull from the earth, or the one that fills your barrels. He squeezed his daughter's hands. The best harvest is the one that grows, with patience and love, in the heart of a family. That night, on the porch under a blanket of stars, the 4 of them sat quietly, watching the valley below, no longer a boss, an employee, and 2 broken girls, but something new, something that didn't yet have a name, but felt solid, real, and lasting. I keep thinking about Ava's hand landing on her father's arm at that table, not running to the person who'd comforted her, but going straight to the one who needed to hear it most. That's not a small choice for a 6-year-old to make. What would it have taken for you to speak up at that table if you'd been the one sitting there? If this one got to you the way it got to me, tell me down in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story traveled. The birthday he forgot. Thomas Reeves stood frozen in his own foyer, briefcase still in hand, listening to 3 small voices sing happy birthday somewhere out past the pool house. For a full 5 seconds, his mind refused to process what his ears were telling him. Then it hit him like a dropped weight. Today was his son's birthday. He had forgotten. He had built his entire calendar around a merger closing in Singapore, and had let his own children's birthday slide off the page entirely. He walked toward the sound, and what he saw through the kitchen window stopped him cold. His 3 boys crowded around a homemade cake, and standing behind them, lighting the candles, was the cleaning woman. She had remembered. He hadn't. And he had no idea yet that the real reason she'd almost quit the week before had nothing to do with him at all. The Reeves estate sat at the end of a long gravel drive in Westchester County, New York, a stone and glass house that photographed beautifully for the real estate section of magazines and felt, to anyone who actually lived there, like the inside of a bank vault. Thomas Reeves ran a private investment firm from a corner office in Manhattan, and he ran his household the same way he ran his portfolio, through delegation, metrics, and a carefully maintained emotional distance he would never have called by that name. His 3 sons, triplets, had a full-time nanny, a tutor, a cook, and a rotating staff of house cleaners, all of whom kept the machinery of the estate running smoothly enough that Thomas rarely had to think about any of it. Jack, Leo, and Cole moved through the enormous house like small princes in an enchanted but mostly empty castle. Their nanny was competent and professional, punctual with schedules and homework checks, but her affection came in the same measured doses as everything else in that house present, adequate and utterly without warmth. The boys, bound together by a loneliness none of them could yet put into words, wanted something their official caregivers weren't built to give. A lap that didn't check the clock, a hand that lingered in their hair, not out of duty but because it wanted to. Isla Monroe had been hired 8 months earlier through a cleaning service that rotated staff between several large properties in the area, and for most of those 8 months, she had done exactly what her job description asked of her, and nothing more. She was, by design, invisible, a woman in a plain uniform who erased the evidence of a family barely living together, straightening toys that no father's hands ever touched, polishing surfaces that reflected nothing back but silence. If Thomas noticed her at all, she was a name on an invoice. But Isla noticed things. She noticed the untouched breakfast plates. She noticed that the boys' artwork, taped to the refrigerator by the nanny out of habit, never once included a figure that looked like their father, except as a small gray shape walking away in the corner of the page. The shift began with small things, the kind that never make it into any job description. A slice of toast cut into the shape of a star for Cole, who'd once mentioned liking stars. A song hummed under her breath while she cleaned Leo's room, the kind that seemed to calm him faster than anything the nanny tried. One afternoon, Jack, the most guarded of the three, showed her a drawing without being asked, his jaw set in the particular way he braced for disappointment. Instead of a hollow compliment, Isla sat down on the floor next to him and asked what story the picture was telling. Nobody in that house had asked him that in longer than he could remember. The first real turning point came during a storm. A crack of thunder sent Cole bolting down the hallway in a panic, not toward the nanny's room, but straight to Isla, who was finishing up a late shift. She found him shaking, wrapped her arms around him without a word, and stayed until the fear dissolved in the warmth of her presence. In that dark hallway, something was sealed that no household hierarchy would ever be able to undo. The signs of this new reality were everywhere, for anyone who cared to look. The most obvious hung on the refrigerator door, fixed with fruit-shaped magnets, a crayon drawing made by all three boys, brutally honest in the way only children's art can be. In the center, a smiling figure with long, dark hair, clearly Isla, held the hands of 3 identical boys under a bright yellow sun. They played in a green field surrounded by flowers. At the far left edge of the page, almost falling out of the frame entirely, a tiny gray figure in a suit walked in the opposite direction, briefcase in hand. It was their father, drawn not as an absence but as a choice, the choice to leave. The drawing wasn't fantasy. It was documentary, a map of the family's emotional truth that hung in plain sight for weeks before anyone with the power to change it ever really looked at it. But while Isla became the sun of the boys' small universe, her own world was sinking deeper into a darkness she carried alone. In her rare moments of privacy, she'd lock herself in the modest staff bathroom during her lunch break, not to rest, but to grip her old phone like a lifeline. Passers-by in the hallway sometimes caught fragments of hushed, anguished calls, words like treatment and don't worry, I'll manage it. Her face, when she came out, carried the marks of an invisible battle, a worry so deep it sometimes left her staring blankly into space, polishing the same silver spoon over and over, oblivious to everything but the weight of her secret. This duality defined her days entirely. Inside the walls of that mansion, she was the reliable provider of comfort, the warm and steady figure anchoring 3 drifting boys to something solid. Her smile was their refuge. Her calm was their peace. But alone with her own thoughts, she was a young woman gripped by fear, tangled in debt and worry, fighting to keep afloat the only family member she had left in the world. Her love for the boys was genuine and deep, but it was also her only breathing room, a small oasis of clean, uncomplicated affection in the middle of a desert of anxiety. Caring for them wasn't only a job, it was the one part of her life where she felt like she could actually fix something, where her presence made an undeniable, positive difference. So, long before Thomas Reeves discovered the birthday party in his own backyard, The emotional map of that house had already been completely redrawn. On the surface, everything looked the same. The wealth, the order, the silence. But underneath, in the invisible currents of affection and need, a new family had quietly formed, one built in the absence of a father and cemented by small, secret acts of love. Isla, the invisible employee, had become the beating heart of that home, while the man who owned it all had become a stranger inside his own walls. The connection between Isla and the boys stopped being a secret and became, instead, the new rhythm of the house's heartbeat. Mornings no longer began with breakfast served by the cook, but with Cole's anxious question the second he woke, "Is Isla here yet?" Homework, technically overseen by a qualified tutor, only moved forward if Isla was somewhere nearby, sitting in a corner of the room, her mere presence an anchor for Jack's restless mind. Leo's old nightmares, once a matter for the night nanny, now only settled with the sound of Isla's voice humming an old lullaby through the baby monitor, a tune that had become the unofficial anthem of his sense of safety. They had woven with her an ecosystem of affection so dense and so real that the rest of the staff, once figures of authority, had been quietly pushed to the margins of the boys' small world. The deepest change showed in their bodies, in the way they gravitated toward her without thinking. If Isla walked down a hallway, 3 pairs of eyes followed her like she was the sun. If she sat down for a brief rest, within seconds Cole would be curled against her side, head in her lap, chasing a physical closeness that was as vital to him as air. Leo interrupted her constantly with jokes and clumsy little tricks, a small clown competing for a smile that mattered more to him than any expensive toy. And Jack, the quiet one, had developed his own private ritual whenever he felt frustrated or sad. He'd find Isla's hand and simply squeeze it, a silent message she understood perfectly, answering with a gentle press back that said, "I'm here. I understand." This natural, effortless bond began sending shockwaves through the rigid structure of the household. The first to notice was the head housekeeper, a woman in her 50s whose loyalty to the family was measured entirely in terms of order and protocol. To her, the house was a machine built for precision, and Isla was becoming a part vibrating badly out of sync. She watched from a distance with a look somewhere between disapproval and genuine bewilderment. She saw the boys ignore the nanny's instructions to follow a simple suggestion from Isla. She heard them reject an elaborately prepared dessert at the table to ask for cookies like Isla makes. Each of these small acts of loyalty was, in her eyes, a microscopic insurrection, a dangerous erosion of the authority she worked hard to maintain in the father's near-constant absence. The comments started small, poisoned little darts dropped in low voices in the staff kitchen. "Seems like somebody's forgetting their place," the cook muttered once, stung that the boys preferred a simple sandwich made by Isla over her carefully plated menu. The tutor, a young woman with a degree in early education, complained to the head housekeeper that her authority was being systematically undermined. Professional jealousy dressed itself up as concern for discipline. The looks that followed Isla down the hallways were no longer indifferent. They were loaded with judgment. She became the subject of every break room conversation, the cleaner who thinks she's their mother. Every gesture of affection Isla offered was reinterpreted by the others as strategy, an ambitious overreach of her role. The air around her thickened, charged with a silent hostility she could feel on the back of her neck. The head housekeeper decided it was time to intervene, to restore the invisible boundaries Isla had erased with such disarming ease. Her first move was subtle but deliberate. One afternoon, while Isla was helping the boys build a fort out of sheets in the yard, the housekeeper's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Isla, the windows in the west wing need cleaning immediately. There's a storm coming tomorrow." It wasn't a request. It was an order designed to remind her of her place, to pull her out of that family scene and back into her role as staff. Isla's smile froze for an instant. The boys protested, but the housekeeper's steel gaze silenced them. With one last apologetic glance at the 3 of them, Isla stood, feeling the weight of every judging eye on her back as she walked away from the sheet fort, leaving a sudden silence behind her. The boy's reaction to this new separation was immediate and visceral. Leo, normally so cheerful, crossed his arms and refused to keep playing, declaring the game boring without Isla. Cole, eyes brimming with tears, ran to his room and shut the door, a silent protest that echoed through the whole house. But it was Jack's reaction that unsettled the housekeeper most. The boy didn't cry or shout. He simply picked up one of the sheets, walked over to her, looked her dead in the eye with a coldness that didn't belong on an 8-year-old's face, and let the sheet drop at her feet. He didn't say a word, but the message was unmistakable. If she broke his world apart, he would refuse to take part in whatever she offered instead. The boy's loyalty wasn't fragile, it was a wall, and they had just shown exactly which side of it they stood on. The tension reached a critical point a week later. Frustrated by the boy's passive resistance, the housekeeper implemented a new unwritten rule. Isla's breaks had to be taken exclusively in the staff room, far from the play areas. One day, while eating her sandwich alone in the quiet kitchen, Isla heard a sharp cry followed by crying coming from the yard. Her instinct was faster than any rule. Through the window, she saw Cole on the ground by the swing set, gripping his knee, blood beginning to well up. The nanny was across the yard, distracted by her phone. For 1 second, Isla froze, the housekeeper's order ringing in her head. But Cole's crying was louder. The risk of being fired paled next to the image of that frightened, injured little boy. Without a second thought, she ran into the yard, knelt beside him, and murmured calm reassurances while she checked the wound, ignoring the grass and blood staining her clean uniform. "There we go, my brave boy. It's all right. Let's clean this up and you'll see it's nothing." She lifted him into her arms, a gesture so natural and protective that for a moment she forgot he wasn't her own son. As she carried him toward the house, her eyes met the housekeeper's, watching from the kitchen doorway. The housekeeper's expression wasn't concern for the child. It was cold, triumphant certainty. Isla had just handed her exactly what she needed, undeniable proof of insubordination. That same night, the confrontation came fast. The housekeeper blocked Isla's path in the main hallway as she was leaving. "Your behavior is unacceptable, Isla. You've overstepped your limits again." Blatantly. Isla, still shaken from the accident, tried to explain the boy had fallen. He'd been alone, but the housekeeper cut her off with a raised hand. "Your job is to clean this house, not raise Mr. Reeves's children. Your contract is very clear, and Mr. Reeves values above all that his staff understand and respect their place." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a final warning. Isla walked to the bus stop that night with a knot of fear in her stomach that went far beyond losing her job. But she had no idea the battle had already escalated to a level she couldn't see coming. Behind her, in a lit office window, the housekeeper was already dialing a number, her voice dropping into a tone of carefully rehearsed concern the moment a deep, distracted voice answered on the other end. The housekeeper's call had been like an injection of poison into Thomas's system. From that moment on, his view of Isla changed entirely. She stopped being an invisible fixture of the house and became a subject of scrutiny, an uncontrolled variable in the equation of his life. He watched from his office window as his sons laughed with her in the yard, and where he once would have seen nothing at all, he now saw strategy. Every hug from Cole, every secret shared by Jack, every trick Leo performed to win her attention looked, to Thomas, like a calculated move in a game he didn't understand. His mind, trained to detect hostile takeovers in the market, began interpreting the situation in exactly those terms. Isla wasn't an affectionate employee. She was an insurgent running a hostile takeover of the most valuable asset in his life, his children's love. He decided to watch her, convinced that sooner or later her real agenda would come to light. Isla felt the shift in the air like an animal senses a coming storm. Thomas's presence in the house grew more frequent and colder. His greetings turned clipped. His gaze lingered on her with an intensity that unsettled her, loaded with a suspicion she couldn't understand. Casual questions turned into veiled interrogations. "Where exactly are you from, Isla? Do you have family nearby? What are your long-term plans?" Each question was a small shovel digging into her private life, searching for something he could use against her. The housekeeper's pressure intensified too, seeming to have a radar for any moment of connection with the boys, interrupting them with urgent chores that pulled Isla away, reminding her constantly that her only function in that house was to clean, tidy, and disappear. The boys, sensing the new hostility with the primal instinct of children who see their only safe harbor threatened, grew more possessive of Isla, as if physical closeness could shield her from a danger they couldn't name. Cole began suffering nighttime anxiety, refusing to sleep unless it was Isla who gave him his last glass of water and tucked him in, a ritual that hadn't existed before. Leo, the group's clown, doubled down on his jokes, his efforts to make her laugh growing almost frantic, a desperate attempt to cut through the rising tension with the sound of joy. But it was Jack, the silent observer, who found the most quietly devastating way to resist. He began leaving small treasures in her cleaning cart, a particularly beautiful bird feather, a shiny trading card, a stolen flower from the prize-winning rosebush in the garden. They were offerings of loyalty, small acts in a silent war that had just been declared. And Isla kept every one of them tucked in the bottom drawer of her nightstand at home, though she never told anyone, not even Thomas, once he finally deserved to know. Thomas witnessed these displays of affection not as proof of a genuine bond, but as confirmation of his worst fears. He saw his son's attachment as a weakness Isla had masterfully exploited, a breach in his emotional security system. His frustration grew as he realized his usual tools of power were completely useless on this battlefield. He couldn't fire her without risking open revolt in his own home, an emotional uprising he wouldn't know how to manage. But he also couldn't tolerate what he perceived as a humiliating subversion of his paternal authority. He felt trapped a king under siege in his own castle, besieged from within by a force he couldn't fight with money or orders. For the first time in his life, he faced a problem with no logical corporate solution, and the helplessness was making him increasingly erratic and increasingly dangerous. Meanwhile, the outside world kept turning at its usual relentless pace, indifferent to the domestic drama consuming him. The merger he'd spent over a year building toward was entering its most critical phase. Calls from his lawyers and partners came in non-stop, demanding the cold, calculating strategist everyone knew. The contrast between his two worlds was almost schizophrenic. In one call, he decided the fate of thousands of employees with a single word. In the next, he heard his son Cole crying in the background, asking for the cleaning woman. This unbearable duality pushed his stress toward dangerous limits. The pressure from his financial empire demanded a fast, efficient resolution to the Isla problem. He needed to cut the knot that had formed in his home so he could go back to focusing on what he believed truly mattered: power, money, and control. In parallel, Isla's personal crisis reached a breaking point. A call from the hospital during her lunch break made her whole world tilt. The doctor's voice, though kind, was brutally clear. Her brother's condition was progressing faster than expected. He needed a new treatment, more aggressive, and of course far more expensive. And above all, he needed more care, more of her presence. The weight on her shoulders became almost physical, a slab that made it hard to breathe. The conflict tearing her apart reached an unbearable intensity. She needed the money from this job more than ever, but her brother needed her time, her strength, her company. Moral duty and sibling love collided head-on with the need to survive. Her brief moments of solitude in the laundry room became silent oceans of tears, an insufficient release for a pain that ran too deep. One night, driven by a toxic mix of suspicion, frustration, and a curiosity he refused to admit even to himself, Thomas crossed a line he could never uncross. He waited until Isla had left for the day and, his heart pounding with an odd mixture of guilt and resolve, let himself into her small room in the staff wing. The act felt like a violation, an invasion of the little privacy she had left, but he told himself it was a necessary step toward understanding the chaos in his house. He was looking for proof, a letter, a diary, anything to confirm his suspicion that Isla had a plan, that her affection was a performance staged for some kind of gain. He needed a logical, tangible reason for the emotional chaos ruling his home, a piece of evidence that would let him take back control. What he found instead completely dismantled his prejudices. The room was a reflection of its owner, tidy, humble, almost anonymous. Nothing suggested ambition or deceit. Only two personal items broke the impersonality of the room, both resting on the small nightstand. The first was a worn photograph of a smiling young man he recognized, with a jolt, as a younger version of the face he'd sometimes glimpsed on her phone's lock screen, her brother. The second was a stack of medical pamphlets with dense, discouraging titles. He picked one up at random. He didn't understand the clinical language, but words like degenerative and palliative care leapt off the page and hit him square in the stomach. For a moment, the armor of his cynicism cracked. This didn't fit the profile of a manipulator. This was evidence of a quiet tragedy. But just as a flicker of empathy threatened to break through, his eyes landed on a folded piece of paper tucked neatly beneath the photo frame, half hidden. He unfolded it with a sense of dread. It was a handwritten letter, clear, firm penmanship. He began to read. "Dear Mr. Reeves, I am writing to inform you of my irrevocable decision to submit my resignation." The word resignation detonated in his mind, erasing in one stroke the empathy that had just begun to surface. His business-trained brain, conditioned by years of hostile negotiations, read the letter not as an act of desperation but as a masterstroke, a bluff, a negotiating tactic to demand a raise. Suspicion, far more familiar and far more comfortable than empathy, came flooding back with redoubled force. He felt deceived, manipulated, and a cold, sharp anger took hold of him. The boys, with the almost seismic intuition children have for detecting the tectonic shifts of adult emotion, sensed something irreparable was about to happen. They noticed Isla moving through the house with a new fragility, a veiled sadness even her smile couldn't hide. They felt she was saying goodbye in silence, and the fear of another abandonment gripped them tight. They became her small shadows, following her everywhere, inventing excuses to touch her, to make sure she was still there. One afternoon, as she cleaned the living room windows, Cole approached and, tugging gently on her uniform, asked in a voice cracked with anguish, "Isla, you're not going to leave, right?" Isla had to summon every ounce of strength she had not to break down in front of him. She knelt, touched his cheek, and whispered a gentle lie that tasted like ash in her mouth. The guilt of knowing she couldn't protect him from that pain was, perhaps, the heaviest weight of all. Thomas decided the time had come for a confrontation, but on his own terms, in his own territory. He wouldn't show her the letter yet. He'd keep it as leverage, a card to play at the height of the negotiation. He summoned her to his study that same afternoon, a fortress of dark wood paneling and books he'd never read, and positioned himself strategically behind his imposing mahogany desk, using the furniture as a barricade, a symbol of the unbridgeable distance he intended to keep between them. When she entered, he didn't even invite her to sit. His tone was the one he used to close deals, stripped of all emotion. "Isla," he said, his voice cutting through the tense silence of the room. "We need to talk about your influence in this house, and about your future here." The threat wasn't subtle. It was a warning shot, a clear message that the game was over. Isla stood before him, feeling the cold of the marble floor through her worn shoes. She had been waiting for this moment, fearing it, and, in some strange way, wanting it. Seeing him there, so powerful, so distant, barricaded behind that fortress of wood, didn't intimidate her. If anything, it lit a small flame of dignity inside her. This was no longer just about a job or money. It was about defending her integrity, honoring the sacrifice she was making for her brother. She straightened her spine, pressed her hands together so they wouldn't shake, and held his icy stare without blinking. The silence crackled with electricity, the prelude to a storm about to tear everything apart. The final confrontation didn't happen in Thomas's imposing study, but in the neutral, sterile territory of the kitchen, a space of stainless steel and white marble, a laboratory built for efficiency, not confessions. Thomas had cornered her there, her back against the cold counter while he blocked the only exit. His face was a mask of contained desperation, that of a strategist who has exhausted every tactic and is about to play his last, most powerful card. There was no trace of suspicion left in his eyes anymore, only a raw, almost childlike need to prevent the disaster he could feel coming. He didn't understand why, but he knew with visceral certainty that Isla's departure would be the final collapse of the fragile structure he called a family. The tension in the room was so thick it seemed to swallow every sound, leaving only the electric hum of the wine cooler and the frantic beat of two conflicted hearts. Desperate, he reached for the only language he fully commanded, the only tool with which he'd built his empire and solved every problem in his adult life. Money. He stepped forward, his voice losing its corporate chill and taking on an urgent, almost pleading tone. "You don't have to leave, Isla. Whatever the housekeeper told you, whatever's worrying you, we can work it out." He paused, like a poker player about to reveal his winning hand. "I'll triple your salary right now. A permanent contract, full benefits, a car if you need one. Just stay." It wasn't an offer. It was a decree, the definitive solution of a man who firmly believed every human problem could be quantified and solved with a bank transfer. He was certain his proposal was unanswerable, a wall of money against which any objection would simply shatter. For one long, agonizing instant, Thomas's offer seemed to float in the air like a life raft thrown to someone drowning. Isla felt the vertigo of it triple her salary. The number danced in her mind, transforming into concrete, painfully desired images. Hospital bills paid off. Her brother's treatment secured. The end of sleepless nights doing math that never added up. She saw the possibility of a breath, a moment of peace in the constant war that was her life. The money wasn't an abstraction. It was time. It was security. It was the difference between hope and despair. The temptation washed over her like a wave threatening to sweep her away, to make her forget why she was standing there at all. For 1 second her resolve wavered. Her eyes drifted to the window, to the world outside where her brother was waiting, and she wondered whether the sacrifice she was about to make was an act of dignity or an unforgivable mistake. But then her gaze returned to Thomas's face, and in his eyes she didn't see a benefactor. She saw a blind man, a man trying to buy with money something that had no price: love, loyalty, time. She saw the same man who had forgotten his own son's birthday, the same man who left them alone in a golden mansion, the same man who now believed he could purchase her presence like one more piece of furniture. And in that moment, the doubt evaporated, replaced by a crystalline calm and an unshakable certainty. Money might ease her problems, but it wouldn't solve the fundamental one: abandonment. She straightened her spine, and though her heart hammered against her ribs, her voice came out steady, without a trace of a tremor. She looked him dead in the eye and, with 3 simple words, brought down the skyscraper of his arrogance. "No, Mr. Reeves." The refusal landed like a shockwave that silenced even the hum of the wine cooler. Thomas stood frozen, processing the word. It was a concept foreign to his entire universe, an answer he never received in boardrooms, from employees, or from his own family. A no with no counteroffer, no negotiation. An absolute no. His expression shifted from confidence to disbelief, and from disbelief to a deep, disarming confusion. He couldn't understand it. He'd placed the universal solution on the table, the balm that cured everything, and she had rejected it as if it were nothing. The foundation of his entire worldview, that everyone and everything had a price, had just suffered a fundamental crack. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as an employee, but as a strange creature from a planet with entirely different physical and moral laws. Unable to accept defeat, he doubled down, his voice now tinged with a frustration bordering on offense. "What do you mean, no? I don't understand. Isn't it enough? How much?" His tone hardened, as if he blamed her for his own incomprehension. "Name your price. Everyone has one." That was the sentence that condemned him, the one that revealed the full depth of his blindness. For him, Isla's refusal couldn't possibly be a matter of principle. It had to be a more sophisticated negotiating tactic. He couldn't conceive of a moral universe where money wasn't king. But for Isla, That sentence was the final confirmation that she'd made the right decision. She no longer felt fear, only an immense, sad pity for that man, so rich and yet so poor at the same time. With a calm that disarmed him completely, Isla spoke the sentence that would detonate the foundations of Thomas Reeves's world, the line that would mark the point of no return for both of them. "It's not about money, Mr. Reeves." Every word landed with a clarity and dignity that filled the silence of the kitchen. It wasn't a challenge or a rebuke. It was a simple statement of fact, the revelation of a truth he was incapable of seeing. In rejecting his offer, Isla wasn't only sacrificing her only source of income and her financial security at a moment of desperate need. She was choosing her integrity. She was risking her future for a non-negotiable moral principle. There are things money can't buy, and there are duties you can't delegate. In that instant, her worth stopped being measured by her salary and started being measured by the strength of her conviction. Isla's no wasn't the end of the conversation. It was the beginning of a new reality. The power in that kitchen had shifted hands irreversibly. Thomas Reeves, the titan of finance, found himself suddenly stripped of his only weapon, reduced to a confused and vulnerable man standing before a woman who, owning nothing, had everything he lacked: moral clarity, dignity, and a love that wasn't for sale. Cornered by a no his mind couldn't process, he took a step closer, invading the little personal space Isla had left. His voice, now stripped of corporate arrogance, was laced with genuine, desperate confusion. "Then what is it, if not money? There has to be something. Nobody turns down an offer like that without a reason. Tell me." It wasn't an order, it was a plea. For the first time in decades, he faced a variable he couldn't calculate, a human equation whose rules he didn't know. He needed to understand, not to negotiate, but so the ground crumbling beneath his feet would stop shaking. Isla breathed in deep, as if the air in that luxury kitchen were too dense for her lungs. The weight of the secret she'd carried in silence for months had become unbearable. The words came out not as an excuse, but as a confession. "My brother," she said, her voice barely a whisper that nonetheless silenced the room. "He's sick, a degenerative condition, and every day he gets a little worse." She looked up, and her usually calm eyes were now two wells of old, exhausted pain. "The doctors say time is running out. This isn't about money for some miracle treatment, Mr. Reeves. It's about time. I need to be with him. I need to go to his appointments, hold his hand when it hurts, make sure he's not alone in this. My resignation isn't a negotiating strategy. It's the only thing I can do. It's my duty." Thomas listened, his analytical brain trying to catalog the information, searching for a solution. His first instinct, once again, was the instinct of power. "I can help. I know the best specialists. I can get him access to any experimental treatment anywhere in the world. I can hire the best nurses to care for him day and night." His offer was sincere, but it was still the offer of a man who saw life as a series of logistical problems solvable with resources. He didn't understand that what Isla was describing wasn't a lack of resources, but a fundamental human need his money couldn't satisfy. He was offering an army to fight a battle that could only be won with presence, with the warmth of a hand, with the comfort of a familiar voice in the dark. Isla shook her head, an infinite sadness in her gaze. She saw the blindness in that man and felt a pang of compassion. "You don't understand," she told him, with a gentleness more devastating than any shout. "Nurses can't read him his favorite book in the voices we invented as kids. Specialists can't tell him the stories our mother used to tell so he doesn't forget her. Money can't sit beside him in silence for hours just so he knows he isn't alone in his fear. I can. It's the only thing I have left to give him, and it's the only thing he truly needs. He needs his sister, not an employee paid with your money." Right at that moment, a soft sound from the hallway broke the tension. A small figure appeared in the kitchen doorway. It was Cole, the most sensitive of the triplets, in his pajamas, eyes red from silent tears. He'd been listening, drawn by the tense voices that had disturbed the quiet of the night, but his gaze didn't go to his father, the man who owned everything he could see. It went straight to Isla. With quick, Determined little steps, he crossed the marble floor and threw his arms around her legs, burying his face in her uniform, as if it were the only safe refuge in the world. The gesture was a declaration of loyalty, a choice made with the pure, brutal honesty of a child. In that embrace, the whole truth of that house was laid bare. Power and money stood on one side of the room. Love and home stood on the other. Then Cole lifted his head, his eyes, carrying a painful wisdom that didn't belong to his 8 years, fixed on his father. His small voice, but steady, rang through the silence with the force of thunder. "Dad," he said, and every syllable was an accusation. "She has to take care of her brother." He paused, swallowing hard, as if the next words weighed too much to carry. "Just like you should have taken better care of Mom when she got sick." The sentence landed in the kitchen like a bomb, shattering the air, the time, and the armor Thomas Reeves had built around his heart over years. It wasn't the voice of a child. It was the echo of his own conscience, the ghost of his greatest failure, coming back to demand an accounting. Thomas's world fractured. The designer kitchen dissolved, replaced by the blinding white of a hospital room. The smell of disinfectant, the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, the feeling of his phone buzzing in his pocket with an urgent call about an acquisition, while he stood there, divided between two worlds, and chose the wrong one. He saw his late wife's pale face, her weak smile, her hand searching for his while he stared at his phone screen. The guilt he'd buried under layers of work, meetings, and business trips, the guilt he'd successfully anesthetized with power and success, surfaced with uncontrollable force, threatening to drown him. The truth wasn't that Isla had to leave. The truth was that he had never really been there. He was repeating the same abandonment, committing the same sin, and this time it was his own son showing it to him. At that exact moment, as if in cruel irony, his phone, abandoned on the counter, began buzzing with frantic insistence. On the screen, the name of his chief operating officer blinked. It was the call, the merger. The deal that would define his professional legacy was at its most critical point. The old Thomas would have answered before the second ring. But the man standing there now, broken and stripped bare before the truth, didn't even glance at the screen. His eyes stayed fixed on his son. On the way, Cole clung to Isla, on the silent accusation still burning in his face. With a slow, almost solemn motion, he reached for the phone, and without looking at it, pressed the red button. The silence that followed was the most eloquent of his life. He had just hung up on his empire. He had just chosen his family. He collapsed not physically, but from within. His posture of power dissolved, his shoulders sagged, and for the first time he looked like a man his own age, vulnerable and lost. He looked at Isla, but he no longer saw an employee or a threat. He saw a woman who had taught him a lesson all his money could never have bought. His voice, when he finally managed to speak, was a rough, unrecognizable whisper. "I'm going to make a call," he said, and the tone wasn't one of command, but of purpose. He picked up the phone again, his trembling fingers dialing not his legal team, but his personal assistant. "I want the best specialist in neurodegenerative disease in the country," he ordered, his voice breaking. "On a private plane if you have to. Get him here now." It wasn't a payment. It was an act of repair, the first brick in the reconstruction of his soul. Thomas's call wasn't a simple order. It was the sound of a world reorganizing itself on a new moral axis. The mansion, once a mausoleum of corporate silence, filled with a different kind of stillness, one of purpose and waiting. The relentless calls from his merger team were silenced one by one with a single, cutting phrase, "Cancel all of it." The staff, used to their employer's absence, watched him wander the halls now not like a ghost, but like a man searching for his own center of gravity. Isla was no longer invisible. She became the center of this new calm. Thomas didn't offer her money, he offered her something far more valuable, his attention. He sat with her in the kitchen, not as a boss, but as an equal, listening to every detail about her brother's illness, asking questions, absorbing a reality that had, until then, been foreign to him. The boys, sensing the seismic shift in the atmosphere, watched from a distance, their faces a mixture of fear and a hope so fragile it almost hurt to look at. Thomas's transformation wasn't a speech, it was a series of irreversible acts. The next day, instead of a contract with inflated numbers, he handed Isla a document he'd written himself overnight. It wasn't an employment contract. It was a declaration of intent. It offered her a salary for life, but the main clause wasn't financial. It guaranteed total flexibility in her schedule, a car and driver at her disposal for hospital trips, and absolute freedom to be absent whenever her brother needed her. No questions asked, no justification required. "This isn't payment for your silence or your work," he told her, his voice free of all arrogance. "It's a small part of the debt I owe you. You taught me something I'd forgotten how to be human. I don't want you to be my employee, Isla. I want you to be part of this family, the part that keeps us sane." It was a validation that went far beyond the professional. It was a recognition of her role as the moral center of a broken home. The real work of repair, though, began with his sons. The first night, Thomas canceled a dinner with international investors and sat down at the table with them. The initial silence was awkward, almost painful. The boys watched him with a mix of suspicion and curiosity, like an exotic animal that had wandered into their living room. He tried to talk about his day, but the words came out stiff, rehearsed. It was Cole who broke the ice, dropping his fork, and when Thomas bent to pick it up, the boy shyly touched his hair. He didn't say anything, but the gesture said everything. That night, Thomas didn't read them a story. He told them one, a clumsy, fragmented memory of his late wife, a beach vacation, how she hated sand but loved the sound of their laughter. It wasn't a perfect story, but it was real. And for the first time in years, all three boys fell asleep feeling the presence of a father in the house, not just a provider. Little by little, the Reeves estate stopped being a property and became a home. Muddy footprints appeared in the marble entryway. Couch cushions turned up out of place in the living room. A half-finished science project sat on the mahogany dining table for a full week before anyone thought to move it. Thomas learned to tolerate the disorder, to see it not as a system failure, but as proof of life. Weekends stopped being for reviewing reports and became failed attempts at making pancakes, water gun battles in the yard, and movie nights where he was always the first to fall asleep. Isla, freed from the crushing weight of constant anxiety, began to breathe easier. Her brother, now under the care of the best specialists, had started a new treatment that gave them both real hope. Her presence in the house grew more relaxed, like a beloved aunt who came to visit and brought calm and wisdom with her, the same calm and wisdom that had saved that family from itself. The final validation came on a gray Saturday afternoon that threatened rain. Thomas and the triplets were in the middle of the yard, covered in mud from head to toe, wrestling clumsily with tent poles and a tarp. The crumpled, stained instructions lay forgotten off to the side. Jack tried to work out a knot. Leo kept tripping over the ropes. Cole laughed hysterically every time a gust of wind nearly carried the tarp away. Thomas, hair a mess, a smear of dirt on his cheek, wasn't giving orders. He was laughing with them, as lost and happy as any of his sons. Isla watched from the kitchen terrace, a warm mug of tea in her hands. She wasn't the invisible employee anymore. She was the architect of that scene, the quiet witness to a small miracle. The man who had everything had finally learned that his real fortune wasn't in the stock market. It was in that chaos of laughter and mud, and in the justice, hard-won and quietly earned, that had finally found its way home. What stays with me isn't the money on the table, it's Cole crossing that kitchen floor straight to Isla without anyone telling him to. Kids that age don't perform loyalty. They just show you where it already lives. I keep wondering what it would take for the rest of us to notice what's right in front of us before an 8-year-old has to say it out loud. If this one landed for you the way it landed for me, let me know down in the comments where you're tuning in from.